It dominates the headlines. The Winter White House. The site of an FBI search that made international news. The backdrop for diplomatic dinners and political strategy sessions. Mar-a-Lago sits on 17 acres of Palm Beach, 126 rooms of Spanish tile and gold-plated fixtures stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth. The red-tiled tower is visible for miles. The 75-foot observation deck offers views that once attracted royalty. But behind those Mediterranean walls is a dynasty most Americans know nothing about. A woman who inherited a cereal fortune at 27 and became the wealthiest woman in the United States. A mansion designed to host presidents that the federal government rejected. Dinners in Moscow under Stalin's regime that shaped Cold War diplomacy. A gift no one wanted. A near demolition that would have erased it from history. And a rescue that came from the last person anyone expected. This is not a story about politics. This is a story about what one woman built, what the government abandoned, and what nearly disappeared forever. Before we step inside those walls, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about forgotten dynasties and the estates they left behind, subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into America's hidden history. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Battle Creek, Michigan, 1891. A man named Charles William Post checked into a health sanatorium, chronically ill, searching for a cure. He was a failed businessman, a man without prospects, suffering from what doctors couldn't diagnose and couldn't fix. The sanatorium was run by John Harvey Kellogg, famous for dietary treatments and health cures that ranged from the scientific to the bizarre. Post stayed for months. He didn't get better. But he learned something that would change his life and the lives of millions of Americans who had never heard his name. He learned that people would pay for hope packaged as health. Post converted to Christian Science after his illness. He began to believe that positive thinking and the right foods could cure anything. Coffee, he decided, was poison to the human body. So he invented an alternative. Roasted wheat bran molasses and water ground together into a dark powder that brewed into something that tasted almost like coffee but contained no caffeine at all. He called it postum. The drink was bitter, strange, nothing like actual coffee. But Post believed in it with the fervor of a convert. He advertised it as a cure for everything from nervousness to bad complexion. The claims were absurd. The Federal Trade Commission would later ban most of them. But in 1895, when Post founded the Postum Cereal Company, regulation was light and desperation was heavy. As a child, his daughter Marjorie helped him paste labels on the jars in a barn that served as their first factory. She was too young to understand what her father was building. She only knew that he worked constantly, that he believed completely, and that he treated her like a partner instead of a child. She watched him fail and refuse to accept failure. She watched him advertise when he had no money for advertising. She watched him convince people to buy something they had never heard of and didn't think they needed. Postum sold, not quickly, but steadily. Post advertised relentlessly in newspapers and magazines. He created testimonials. He wrote copy that promised transformation. He understood something about human nature that other businessmen of his era missed. People didn't just want products. They wanted solutions to problems they didn't know they had. By 1897, Post had launched Grape Nuts, a cereal so hard it had to be soaked in milk before eating. The name made no sense. It contained neither grapes nor nuts, but it sold. By 1904, he added Post Toasties. Sales approached $1 million. By 1909, C.W. Post had made $5 million from breakfast cereal and a coffee substitute. Marjorie was learning a different curriculum than other girls her age. While her classmates at finishing school studied etiquette and piano, she attended board meetings. She was 10 years old, sitting in rooms full of men twice her father's age, listening to him negotiate contracts and plan expansions. He took her to factories. He showed her the production lines. He explained margins and market share and the importance of controlling every step from manufacturing to distribution. He was training her for something specific, though neither of them said it out loud. She was his only child. If anything happened to him, Everything would fall to her. He wanted to make sure she was ready. Her mother, Ella Letitia Merriweather, died in 1912. Marjorie was 25, already married to her first husband, Edward Bennett Close, an investment banker from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had two daughters, Adelaide and Eleanor. Her life seemed settled in the patterns of early 20th century upper-class domesticity. Then, on May 9th, 1914, everything shattered. Charles William Post locked himself in his room at their home in Santa Barbara, California, and shot himself. He was 59 years old. He had been suffering from severe abdominal pain for months. He believed he was terminally ill. An autopsy would later show he wasn't, but the belief was enough. Marjorie was 27 years old. She inherited a $20 million fortune, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. She inherited the Postum Cereal Company, factories in Michigan and New York, contracts with distributors across the country, and a brand that millions of Americans recognized and trusted. Her father's second wife, Layla Young, whom he had married after leaving Marjorie's mother, contested the will. She claimed half the stock. Marjorie fought her in court and out of court. She proved her father had promised everything to her. She proved she had been his partner in building the business. She settled with Layla for $6 million just to end the dispute and move forward. Then she took control. The board of directors expected her to appoint a man to run things. They expected her to marry well, defer to her husband, and collect dividends while men made decisions. She didn't. Within a year of her father's death, Marjorie had taken full operational control of Postum. She was a widow. Her marriage to Edward Bennett Close was deteriorating and would end in divorce in 1919, with two young daughters and more money than most men would accumulate in 10 lifetimes. The newspapers called her the wealthiest woman in the United States. She was only getting started. She proved them right. By 1920, she had remarried. Edward Francis Hutton was a Wall Street financier, the founder of E.F. Hutton and Company, one of the most respected brokerage firms in America. He was everything Edward Close had not been. Sophisticated where Close had been provincial, ambitious where Close had been complacent, comfortable with her wealth instead of intimidated by it. Hutton saw Marjorie not as a woman who needed to be managed, but as a partner who could help him build something larger than either of them could create alone. In 1922, under Hutton's chairmanship, Postum went public on the New York Stock Exchange. The offering was oversubscribed. Investors understood what they were buying: a company that had turned breakfast into an industry, a company that had convinced Americans to change what they ate every morning, a company that printed money as reliably as it printed cereal boxes. Then Hutton and Marjorie began acquiring competitors, not gradually, aggressively. Jell-O came first, then Maxwell House Coffee, Log Cabin Syrup, Swan's Down Flour, Minute Tapioca, Hellman's Mayonnaise, Baker's Chocolate. One by one, the brands folded into Postum. Hutton was chairman of the board, structuring the deals and negotiating terms, but the bird's-eye acquisition was Marjorie's. She saw what others didn't. Clarence Birdseye had invented a process for flash-freezing food that preserved taste and nutrition. No one else believed Americans would buy frozen vegetables and fish. The idea seemed absurd. Why would anyone purchase frozen food when fresh food was available at any market? Marjorie understood. Frozen food wasn't about replacing fresh food. It was about convenience. It was about making dinner possible for women who didn't have servants and didn't have time. She persuaded the board to purchase the company in 1929 for $22 million. It was the largest acquisition in the company's history. The same year, Postum officially became General Foods Corporation. The new name reflected reality. The company no longer made cereal and coffee substitutes. It made everything Americans ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was the largest food company in America. Marjorie sat on the board of directors, one of the first women to serve as a director of a major American corporation. She attended every meeting. She read every report. She asked questions that made men who underestimated her uncomfortable. She had learned from her father that the person who understood the numbers controlled the company. While she was building a food empire, she was building an empire of estates in parallel, a 176-acre property on Long Island with a Tudor mansion that would later become C.W. Post College. a 54-room penthouse in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue, the largest apartment ever built at that time, occupying the entire top floors of a building constructed on the site of the former Burden Mansion. Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks, 68 buildings on 207 acres surrounding Upper St. Regis Lake, on Harndolindaying Harninipring, a wilderness retreat that could accommodate dozens of guests in luxury. And the Sea Cloud, a yacht she designed herself, specifying every detail from the teak decks to the marble bathrooms. When it launched in 1931, it was the largest privately owned sailing yacht in the world. It required a crew of 75. In 1923, Marjorie gave birth to her third daughter. Nedaniah Marjorie Hutton would grow up to become the actress Dina Merrill, starring in films with Cary Grant and Burt Lancaster, serving on corporate boards, and eventually becoming known as the richest actress of all time, with a net worth in the billions. But that was decades away. In 1929, Marjorie Merriweather Post owned the largest food corporation in America. Estates in 3 states, a penthouse that occupied an entire city block worth of vertical space, and the world's largest private yacht. She was 42 years old. She had more money than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. She had proven she could build and run a business as well as any man alive. But she wanted one more thing: a house by the sea, a palace, a monument that would last 1,000 years. Palm Beach, Florida, 1924. Marjorie and her realtor crawled through jungle-type undergrowth on their hands and knees, searching for solid ground. Palm Beach was already established as the winter retreat for the wealthiest families in America. The Vanderbilts had built estates there, the Stotesburys, the Dodges. Addison Misner was designing Spanish Revival mansions up and down the island, creating an architectural vocabulary that would define the region for the next century. Marjorie wanted to join them, but she wanted something specific. She wanted property that touched both the ocean and the lake. She wanted to build something that would outlast her by centuries. She wanted a palace that looked like it had been transported stone by stone from the Mediterranean coast. A house that would make people stop and stare and wonder who had the vision and the fortune to create such a thing. The site she found was 17 acres of coral reef covered in dense vegetation between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth Lagoon. The undergrowth was so thick she had to crawl through it with her realtor, Lytle Hull, just to see if the ground underneath was solid enough to support the foundation of a major structure. It was. The coral reef would anchor the house through hurricanes and tropical storms for the next 100 years. She purchased the land immediately. She named it before construction began: Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake in Spanish. The name captured what made the property unique. Most estates in Palm Beach faced either the ocean or the lake. Hers would span from one to the other. She hired Marion Sims Wyeth as the architect. Wyeth had studied at Princeton and trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most prestigious architectural school in the world. He had worked with Carrere and Hastings, the firm that had designed the New York Public Library and dozens of Gilded Age mansions. He had built homes for the Sharpies family and the Armour family in Palm Beach. He understood what wealthy clients wanted, but more importantly, he understood what Marjorie wanted: a house that combined Spanish, Moorish, and Venetian architectural elements, a house that looked ancient but was built with modern engineering, a house that could withstand a Category 5 hurricane without losing a single tile from its roof. For the interior design and decorative elements, she hired Joseph Urban. Urban was Austrian, a former architect for Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary and the Khedive of Egypt. He had designed the Austrian pavilions for the 1904 St. Louis Exposition and won the grand prize for excellence in design. He had built the Ziegfeld Theater in New York. He had worked on opera houses and private estates across Europe. He knew how to create spectacle and grandeur. He knew how to make a room feel like a throne room without being ostentatious. Marjorie sent him to Vienna to find the best craftsman in Europe. Urban came back with Professor Franz Barwig, a sculptor and woodcarver who had worked for the emperor. Barwig would spend the next 3 years carving models and molds for parrots, monkeys, dolphins, and botanical motifs. Those original models still survive in the mansion today, preserved behind glass in what was once a service corridor. Construction began in 1923. Some sources say 1924. The records conflict, likely because site preparation and foundation work began in late 1923, but the actual construction of the main house didn't start until early 1924. What's certain is that the project took 4 years and employed 600 workers at its peak. This was significant for reasons beyond the scale of the house. Florida had entered the Great Depression earlier than the rest of the country. The land boom that had drawn Marjorie and thousands of other wealthy Americans to Palm Beach was already collapsing by 1926. Banks were failing. Construction projects were being abandoned half-finished. Workers were being laid off by the thousands. Marjorie kept her project moving. She ensured her workers were fed. She paid them through the downturn. She kept 600 families employed when employment was disappearing across the state. The materials came from across Europe and required years to assemble. 3 boatloads of Dorian limestone from Genoa, Italy, shipped across the Atlantic and unloaded at the port of Palm Beach. It's a fossil-bearing stone, and if you look closely at the exterior walls today, you can still see tiny seashells and fragments of ancient marine life embedded in the rock. Marjorie chose it specifically because it ages rapidly, developing a patina within years that makes new construction look like it has stood for centuries. She wanted the house to look old from the moment it was finished. 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, some dating to the 15th century. Marjorie had purchased the entire collection from the estate of a woman who had spent decades assembling tiles from demolished buildings across Spain. Each tile was numbered, cataloged, and shipped to Palm Beach, where craftsmen spent months installing them by hand throughout the house. 2,200 square feet of black and white marble floor blocks, imported from a Cuban castle that had been demolished to make way for modern development. Gold-plated fixtures for every one of the 33 bathrooms. Marjorie believed gold plating was more resistant to corrosion from salt air and easier to clean than standard brass or chrome. Whether this was scientifically accurate or simply a preference for how gold looked is unclear. What's certain is that every bathroom fixture in the house was plated in gold. The dining table was designed by Joseph Urban using motifs from antique tables in the Pitti Palace and the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Urban sketched the design, then hired the School of the Medici, the same institution that had built the original Renaissance tables, to construct it in Florence. 15 artists worked for over a year to inlay the 4,000-pound table with designs in wood and stone. When it was finished, it was shipped to Palm Beach in pieces and reassembled in the dining room. Large glass panels for the windows had to be custom-made at a factory in Pittsburgh and transported by rail to Florida. The panels were so large that the freight cars carrying them had to be rerouted around tunnels and under bridges that didn't have enough clearance. When one panel shattered during transit, the entire manufacturing and shipping process had to be repeated, delaying construction by months. The house was anchored to the coral reef with concrete pilings and steel reinforcements. Wyeth knew that hurricanes were inevitable in South Florida. He designed the structure to withstand winds that would flatten conventional construction. The roof tiles were individually secured. The windows were protected by heavy wooden shutters. The tower was built with walls thick enough to serve as a hurricane shelter. The result was a 2-story main house with a 75-foot tower, 118 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, and public spaces designed for entertaining hundreds of guests. The living room measured 1,800 square feet with 42-foot ceilings covered in gold leaf copied from the thousand-wing ceiling in Venice's Accademia Gallery. The dining room was modeled on the Palazzo Chigi in Rome, with walls covered in antique fabric and a ceiling painted to resemble the sky at dusk. The tower held an observation deck that offered views across the entire island of Palm Beach, from the Atlantic breakers to the calm waters of Lake Worth. The total cost was $7 million. In today's money, adjusting for inflation, that's approximately $127 million. It was one of the most expensive private homes ever built in the United States. January 1927. The house was finished. Every tile had been placed by hand. Every stone had been carved in Europe and shipped across the Atlantic. Every piece of furniture had been selected personally by Marjorie, or chosen by decorators working under her direct supervision. The house sat between the ocean and the lagoon, exactly as she had imagined it 5 years earlier, when she crawled through the undergrowth with little Hull. It looked like it had stood for centuries. It looked like something a Spanish viceroy would have built in the 16th century. Not something a serial heiress had constructed in the 1920s, a palace built from breakfast food. A monument to what one invention, a coffee substitute that tasted nothing like coffee, could generate across 2 generations. Now she had to fill it. She filled it with royalty. Marjorie and E.F. Hutton spent their winters at Mar-a-Lago, arriving in mid-January and staying through late March, hosting dinners that made the society pages of the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Being invited to Mar-a-Lago became a status symbol in Palm Beach, a sign that you had arrived not just financially, but socially. The house was designed specifically for large-scale entertaining. The main public rooms, the living room, the dining room, the ballroom, were separated from the family quarters and service areas by long corridors and strategic placement. Marjorie could host 300 guests for dinner without any of them seeing the kitchens, the servants' quarters, or the family bedrooms. She hosted dinner parties where guests dressed in 18th century costumes. She hosted charity events that raised thousands of dollars for local causes. She hosted concerts featuring musicians brought down from New York. She hosted costume balls that were covered by photographers from national magazines. In March of 1929, Marjorie and Hutton gave an elaborate dinner before the annual Everglades Costume Ball. They dressed as French aristocrats from the court of Louis XVI. Marjorie wore a gown that had been made in Paris specifically for the occasion, covered in jewels that had belonged to Marie Antoinette. Hutton wore brocade and powder and a wig that made him look like he had stepped out of a Versailles portrait. A few score guests attended, all in period costume, all competing to outdo each other in historical accuracy and expense. The society reporters who covered the event described it as one of the most elaborate private parties ever held in Palm Beach, which was saying something in a town where elaborate parties were the primary form of recreation. That same year, Marjorie hired the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to perform at Mar-a-Lago as a charity fundraiser. She had a tent erected on the grounds. She invited the wealthiest families in Palm Beach to attend and donate. Then she did something unexpected. She invited underprivileged children from West Palm Beach to attend the circus alongside the millionaires. The children sat in the same tent, watched the same elephants and acrobats, ate the same popcorn. It was an act of generosity that newspapers noted with approval. The New York Times obituary that would run decades later would describe Marjorie as a hostess at her core, a woman who had built Mar-a-Lago because her first Florida home had become too small for the parties she wanted to throw. The golden age lasted 8 years. Then everything collapsed at once. October 1929. The stock market imploded. Fortunes that had seemed as permanent as granite evaporated in days. Men who had been worth millions on Monday were bankrupt by Friday. Some of them jumped from the windows of their offices in Manhattan. Hoovervilles, tent cities for the newly homeless, appeared in major American cities almost overnight. Marjorie was insulated from the worst of it. People still needed to eat. General Foods continued to generate revenue and profit, but she was shaken by what was happening. The Great Depression distressed her profoundly. The sight of breadlines and unemployment offices filled with men who had once held good jobs disturbed her sense of how the world was supposed to work. She began sponsoring charity balls to raise money for the unemployed. She led a gifts campaign for the Salvation Army Women's Emergency Aid Committee. She donated personally to unemployment relief efforts in New York and Michigan. She couldn't fix the Depression, but she could help the people it was destroying, and she did. The high cost of building Mar-a-Lago had already strained her marriage to Hutton. $7 million was an enormous sum even for people as wealthy as they were. Hutton thought it was excessive. They disagreed about the Birdseye acquisition as well. Hutton thought frozen food was a fad. Marjorie thought it was the future. They disagreed about how much money to spend on the estates, how much time to spend in Palm Beach, how to raise their daughter Nedaniah. By 1935, the disagreements had hardened into something neither of them could repair. The marriage was over in everything but name. Marjorie and E.F. Hutton divorced. The mansion was closed. The staff was dismissed. The furniture was covered with sheets. For 5 seasons, Mar-a-Lago sat empty and silent. The parties stopped. The society reporters moved on to other estates, other hosts, other sources of gossip and spectacle. But Marjorie was not a woman who stayed still for long. That same year, she married again. His name was Joseph E. Davies. He was a Washington lawyer, and he was about to be appointed ambassador to the Soviet Union. December 1935. The wedding was a $100,000 affair in Marjorie's 66-room penthouse on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Everything was pink. The flowers were pink. The tablecloths were pink. The lighting was designed to cast a pink glow over the entire reception. Marjorie gave the caterer a swatch of fabric from her wedding gown, and he matched it perfectly in the icing of the 5-tier wedding cake. The bride was 48 years old. The groom was 59. Washington society was scandalized, not by the age difference, but by the circumstances. Davies had just divorced his wife of 33 years, Emlyn, a fixture of the Washington social establishment, a woman everyone knew and respected. Marjorie was a divorcee from New York, a businesswoman, a woman who sat on corporate boards and made decisions that affected thousands of employees. Now, she was too independent, too wealthy, too comfortable wielding power for the tastes of Washington's old guard, who believed women should defer to their husbands in all things. The wedding made headlines. The honeymoon made bigger headlines. They sailed to the Caribbean on the Sea Cloud with a crew of 75, spending weeks alone on a yacht larger than most people's homes. Within a year, they would be in Moscow, living in a world most Americans couldn't imagine. August 1936. President Franklin Roosevelt called Davies to his retreat in the Adirondacks and asked him to come to Washington for a meeting. When they met, Roosevelt said he had decided he wanted Davies to serve as an ambassador. He asked whether Davies had a preference for a particular country. Davies replied, "Either Russia or Germany. They're the most dynamic spots in Europe." The German ambassadorship wasn't available. The position in Berlin was filled, but the Soviet posting was open. The previous ambassador, William Bullitt, had resigned in frustration after 2 years of dealing with Stalin's government. Roosevelt needed someone loyal, someone who would report directly to him, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Moscow or swayed by the professional diplomats at the State Department who viewed the Soviet Union with suspicion and hostility. Davies accepted. He took the oath of office in November of 1936. In January of 1937, he, Marjorie, and his daughter Eleanor from his first marriage sailed for Europe on the Sea Cloud. They would spend the next year and a half in one of the most dangerous and fascinating capitals in the world. The appointment was controversial from the start. Davies had no diplomatic training. He had never worked in the Foreign Service. He didn't speak Russian. He didn't have experience with Soviet politics or communist ideology. He was a corporate lawyer who had handled international business cases and served as the first chairman of the Federal Trade Commission under Woodrow Wilson. But he was a personal friend of Franklin Roosevelt. They had known each other since the Wilson administration. Roosevelt trusted him. Roosevelt wanted someone in Moscow who would send him honest assessments of Soviet strength and intentions during a period when Nazi Germany was rearming and the balance of power in Europe was shifting dangerously. Davies would serve from November of 1936 to June of 1938. Marjorie would transform what could have been a diplomatic footnote into something far more significant. Her official role as the ambassador's wife was to facilitate diplomatic relations between American and Soviet officials by hosting social events that brought people together in informal settings. She did this by organizing dinners at Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence in Moscow, a grand mansion that had been built for a Russian sugar magnate before the revolution. These were not casual meals. They were carefully orchestrated diplomatic events designed to create relationships between two powers that had been isolated from each other for nearly 2 decades. The United States had only recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate government in 1933. Relations were still fragile, still evolving, still uncertain. Marjorie approached the dinners the way she had approached everything else in her life, with meticulous attention to detail and a refusal to accept anything less than perfection. She selected the guest lists personally, balancing Soviet officials with American diplomats and foreign journalists. She chose the menus, working with Russian chefs to create meals that combined American and Russian cuisines. She selected the table settings, drawing from her personal collection of French and Russian porcelain that she had shipped to Moscow specifically for these events. She paired the plates and silverware with fresh flowers, pink and yellow orchids flown in from hothouses in Europe, because they weren't available in Moscow. She understood something fundamental about diplomacy. Important conversations didn't happen in formal meetings with note-takers and translators. They happened over dinner, after the second glass of wine, when people relaxed and spoke honestly. She created the conditions for those conversations to happen. What she also did in Moscow during the year and a half she lived there was shop. The Soviet government under Joseph Stalin was selling art treasures that had been seized from the Romanov family and former Russian aristocrats after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Stalin needed hard currency to fund the massive industrialization programs he had launched. The 5-year plans required importing machinery and expertise from the West, and that required dollars and pounds and francs, so the Soviet government sold art. Fabergé eggs that had been made for the czars, porcelain from the imperial factories, furniture from palaces, religious icons painted in the 15th and 16th centuries, oil paintings by Russian masters. The items were being sold through official government channels and through dealers who had government authorization. Marjorie bought extensively. She spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on imperial Russian art, building what would eventually become the most comprehensive collection of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. Critics would later claim she was purchasing looted property at discount prices, taking advantage of a desperate government and acquiring treasures that rightfully belonged to the Russian people. The allegations were politically charged and emotionally resonant, but they were never proven in any court. What's certain is that Marjorie purchased the items from recognized Soviet government agencies. She paid the asking prices. She obtained export licenses. She followed all the procedures that existed at the time. Whether those procedures were legitimate or whether the Soviet government had the moral right to sell property it had confiscated is a different question, one that doesn't have a simple answer. The collection is now on permanent display at Hillwood, Marjorie's estate in Washington, D.C., where scholars and visitors can see what she assembled during those 18 months in Stalin's Moscow. Davies served in Brussels as the American ambassador to Belgium from 1938 to 1939, a quieter posting after the intensity of Moscow. Then he returned to the United States when war broke out in Europe. In 1941, with Roosevelt's explicit permission and encouragement, Davies published a book called Mission to Moscow. It was a compilation of his diary entries, personal letters, and State Department dispatches from his time as ambassador, edited and arranged chronologically to tell the story of Soviet-American relations in the crucial years before World War II. The book sold close to 700,000 copies worldwide and was translated into multiple languages. In 1943, it was adapted into a film by Warner Brothers, with Walter Huston playing Davies and Anne Harding playing Marjorie. Both the book and the film presented the Soviet Union in a positive light, arguing that Stalin could be trusted as a partner against Nazi Germany and that American suspicions of Soviet intentions were overblown. This was controversial when the book was published. It became even more controversial after the war, when the Cold War began and Stalin's true nature became clearer. Critics accused Davies of being naive, of being manipulated by Soviet propaganda, of seeing what he wanted to see instead of what was actually happening. Professional diplomats who had served under him in Moscow were scathing in their assessments. George F. Kennan, who would go on to become one of the most important American diplomats of the 20th century, wrote in his memoirs that Davies had drawn the instant distrust of everyone in the embassy's professional staff. But Davies believed what he believed. He thought Stalin was a realist who could be negotiated with. He thought the Soviet Union would honor its commitments. He thought cooperation was possible. History would prove him wrong on almost every count. Marjorie and Joseph Davies divorced in 1955. They had been married 20 years, longer than any of Marjorie's other marriages, but the end was inevitable. Davies had his own life, his own interests, his own social circle in Washington that didn't always overlap with Marjorie's. She kept the Russian art. She kept the Washington estate, Tregaron, a 29-acre property where they had entertained lavishly during the war years. The gardens at Tregaron included hothouses that grew 80 different species of orchids, maintained by a full-time gardener whose only job was to care for the flowers. Davies and Marjorie had been famous in Washington as a waltz team, dancing at parties and formal receptions with the grace of professionals. But all partnerships have an end. She reclaimed the name she had always preferred, the name that connected her to her father and the empire he had built from a sanatorium bed. Marjorie Merriweather Post, and she returned to Mar-a-Lago. The mansion had been closed since 1935. 2 decades had passed. The house had sat empty through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the beginning of the Cold War. She was 68 years old, and she had a plan. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. She would turn Mar-a-Lago into what she had always believed it should be, a winter White House, not a private home for one family, but a public resource for the nation, a place where presidents could retreat during the cold Washington winters and conduct business in a more relaxed setting than the formality of the White House itself, a venue for hosting foreign dignitaries and conducting the quiet diplomacy that happens away from cameras and reporters. She had the model in her mind. The British royal family had Balmoral in Scotland and Sandringham in Norfolk. Why shouldn't American presidents have Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach? She resumed using Mar-a-Lago herself in the late 1940s, spending winters there and reopening the house for entertaining. In 1957, she agreed to host the International Red Cross Ball at Mar-a-Lago. The event was a success, raising substantial money for the Red Cross and re-establishing Mar-a-Lago as a significant venue in Palm Beach society. The ball would be held at Mar-a-Lago many times over the following years, becoming an annual tradition that cemented the estate's role as a center for charitable work in South Florida. In 1958, she married for the 4th time. Herbert A. May was a wealthy Pittsburgh businessman and the former master of foxhounds of the Rolling Rock Hunt Club in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. He was a sportsman, a man who loved horses and hunting, and the social world that revolved around country estates and fox hunts. The marriage was brief. It ended in divorce in May of 1964. She reclaimed her name once again, for the final time. Marjorie Merriweather Post, 4 marriages, 4 divorces, 3 daughters. A business empire that fed millions of Americans every morning, multiple estates across the country, and one consuming final project that would occupy the last decade of her life. She had originally planned to donate Mar-a-Lago to the state of Florida as a center for advanced scholars, a place where academics and researchers could gather to think and work away from the distractions of university life. She had the proposal drawn up, bound in red leather, and presented formally to state officials. The state of Florida reviewed it carefully, calculated what it would cost to maintain a 118-room mansion on 17 acres with antique tiles and gold fixtures, and politely declined. The maintenance costs would be astronomical. The state didn't have the budget. The answer was no, so Marjorie shifted to Plan B. She would gift Mar-a-Lago to the federal government to serve as a winter White House for presidents and visiting foreign dignitaries. She worked toward this vision methodically through the 1960s, securing the necessary designations and approvals. In 1969, the Department of the Interior designated Mar-a-Lago a National Historic Site. The official designation noted that the estate provided an excellent picture of winter resort life in Palm Beach prior to the Depression, which was bureaucratic language for acknowledging that the house was historically and architecturally significant. In 1972, Congress placed Mar-a-Lago on the National Register of Historic Places, giving it formal federal recognition and protection. Marjorie Merriweather Post died at her Hillwood estate in Washington, D.C. on September 12, 1973. She was 86 years old. She had been ill for some time, her health declining slowly over the previous year. She was buried in a private ceremony at Hillwood. Her will, which ran to dozens of pages and had been revised multiple times over the years, left the bulk of her personal estate to her 3 daughters, Adelaide, Eleanor, and Nadinia. But Mar-a-Lago went to the United States government with explicit, detailed instructions. It was to be used for state visits and as a winter White House. She had planned carefully. She had secured the historic designations. She had filed all the necessary paperwork. She had worked with lawyers and advisors to structure the bequest in a way that would make it easy for the government to accept and use. She had done everything a person of her intelligence, experience, and resources could possibly do to ensure her vision would outlast her. What she could not have predicted, what no amount of planning could have anticipated, was that the federal government would have absolutely no idea what to do with it. The problems were immediate and expensive and completely predictable to anyone who understood bureaucracy. The National Park Service took possession of 118 rooms, 33 bathrooms, 17 acres of landscaped grounds, and a maintenance bill that ran approximately $1 million per year. That figure included the cost of maintaining the buildings, the grounds, the tile roofs, the antique fixtures, the specialized systems that kept the place habitable in Florida's heat and humidity. It included staff salaries for the groundskeepers, the maintenance workers, the people who would need to be employed full-time just to keep the place from deteriorating. Marjorie's bequest had provided some money for maintenance, but nothing close to what was actually required. The gap between what she had left and what was needed was measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. The government was expected to make up the difference from general funds at a time when budgets were tight and Congress was looking for places to cut spending, not increase it. The security concerns were even more overwhelming than the maintenance costs. Mar-a-Lago sits directly in the flight path of Palm Beach International Airport, just a couple of miles from the main runway where commercial jets take off and land every few minutes. Securing the property for a presidential visit would require establishing a no-fly zone that would shut down air traffic for the duration of the stay. It would require cordoning off streets in a residential neighborhood where people lived year-round and expected to be able to drive to their own homes. It would require deploying Coast Guard patrols on both the Atlantic Ocean side and the Lake Worth Lagoon side, monitoring boat traffic that would normally flow freely through those waters. The Secret Service reviewed the site thoroughly and reported back to the White House and the National Park Service with a clear assessment. Mar-a-Lago would be extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive to secure for a sitting president. Not impossible, but so difficult and so expensive that it hardly seemed worth the trouble. The presidents weren't interested anyway. Richard Nixon toured the property in the early 1970s, walking through the rooms and looking at the architecture and the ocean views. He was polite. He thanked the National Park Service representatives who showed him around. Then he went back to his Florida White House in Key Biscayne, on the other side of the state, a smaller property that was easier to secure and more to his personal taste. The Watergate scandal broke soon after, consuming the rest of Nixon's presidency and making any consideration of Mar-a-Lago irrelevant. Gerald Ford, who succeeded Nixon, never visited. Jimmy Carter, who took office in 1977, showed no interest at all. The property sat essentially unused for 7 years while the government paid for minimal maintenance and groundskeeping. The federal government held no events there. It hosted no diplomats. It invited no foreign leaders. It didn't even use it as housing for visiting dignitaries or as a venue for conferences or retreats. It just sat there, a 118-room mansion on 17 acres of prime Palm Beach real estate, costing the taxpayers approximately $1 million per year for the privilege of owning a property that served no purpose and generated no benefit. In 1980, Congress designated Mar-a-Lago a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of historic recognition the federal government can bestow on a property. The recognition meant nothing in practical terms. The costs remained. The interest didn't materialize. The house continued to sit empty. On December 23, 1980, Congress passed Public Law 96-586, returning Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation. 7 years of federal ownership had accomplished exactly nothing. Not a single presidential visit. Not a single diplomatic reception. Not a single state dinner or international meeting or meaningful use of any kind. The house had sat empty while the government paid maintenance costs and argued about what to do with it. Marjorie's dream of a winter White House had failed completely. The government had rejected her gift, not because they didn't appreciate it, but because they simply couldn't afford it and couldn't use it. The Post Foundation, now controlled by Marjorie's daughters and a board of trustees, took possession of the property once again and immediately began looking for a buyer. Any buyer. The Post Foundation listed Mar-a-Lago for sale in 1981. The asking price was $20 million. a figure that reflected both the cost of construction adjusted for inflation and the fair market value of 17 acres of ocean-to-lake property in Palm Beach. The furnishings alone, the antique tables, the porcelain, the artwork, the chandeliers, had been professionally appraised at $8 million. But the timing was terrible. By the 1950s and 1960s, social tastes had changed dramatically across Florida and the Northeast. The grand estates that had been built in the 1920s were falling out of fashion. Families couldn't afford to maintain them. The property taxes were crushing. The maintenance costs were overwhelming. The staff requirements were impossible for all but the very wealthiest families, and even wealthy families were choosing to build smaller, more modern homes rather than maintaining palaces built for a different era. Many mansions constructed in the Gilded Age and the 1920s were being demolished across Palm Beach and Newport and the Hamptons. Developers bought them, tore them down, and subdivided the land into smaller lots for contemporary houses that wealthy people actually wanted to live in. Local governments didn't intervene to stop the demolitions because maintaining these properties as museums or public buildings was prohibitively expensive. Mar-a-Lago was rapidly becoming what real estate professionals had started calling a white elephant, a property so large and so expensive to maintain that it becomes a burden instead of an asset. A property that costs more to own than it could ever generate in value. Marjorie's daughters, including actress Dina Merrill, who by this point was famous from dozens of films and television appearances, did not maintain the property while it was on the market. They were anticipating a sale. They saw no reason to spend money on upkeep for a property that would soon belong to someone else. They dismissed most of the staff. They stopped regular maintenance on the grounds. The gardens grew wild. Vines crept up the walls. The paint on the exterior began to fade and peel. The mechanical systems fell into disrepair. The house started to look abandoned, which made it even harder to sell because potential buyers would tour the property and see not a palace, but a deteriorating mansion that would require millions in restoration before anyone could actually live there. 3 serious purchase attempts collapsed. Buyers would make offers, conduct inspections, calculate the costs of restoration and ongoing maintenance, and walk away. The property sat on the market for years with almost no interest. The crisis deepened month by month. By the early 1980s, the Post Foundation was actively discussing demolition. The house was unsellable. The land underneath it was worth millions, but only if the house was gone and the property could be subdivided. In the early 1980s, demolition permits were approved by the town of Palm Beach. One of the most iconic estates in America, a National Historic Landmark, was months away from being torn down. The wrecking crews had been contacted. The timeline had been established. Then a real estate developer from New York picked up the phone and made a call. Donald Trump was 36 years old in 1982. He was a Manhattan real estate developer who had built his reputation on aggressive deals and high-profile properties. He had renovated the Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt. He had built Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. He collected trophy properties the way some people collected art. Mar-a-Lago interested him for exactly the reasons it had failed to interest anyone else. It was huge. It was historic. It was unlike anything else in America. He made an offer of $15 million for the property. The Post Foundation reviewed the offer, consulted with their advisors, and rejected it. They wanted $20 million. They needed $20 million to satisfy the foundation's obligations and distribute assets to the heirs. Trump's response was to walk away. He didn't increase his bid. He didn't negotiate. He just stopped returning calls. He understood something about leverage that the foundation's advisors apparently didn't. Time was on his side. The longer the property sat unsold, the more desperate the foundation would become. 3 years passed. During those 3 years, Trump made another move that would later be described in business schools as a masterclass in negotiation leverage. Jack C. Massey, the businessman who had made a fortune as the former owner of Kentucky Fried Chicken, owned a narrow strip of land between Mar-a-Lago and the Atlantic Ocean. The strip was only a few hundred feet wide, but it was positioned in exactly the right place to matter. Trump purchased it from Massey for $2 million in a quiet transaction that didn't make headlines. Then Trump announced his intention to the Post Foundation and to the Palm Beach newspapers. He was going to build a house on that strip of land. Not a small beach cottage, a large house, a substantial house, a house that would sit directly between Mar-a-Lago and the ocean, blocking the estate's ocean view completely. The announcement had exactly the effect Trump intended. Whatever limited interest still existed in Mar-a-Lago evaporated overnight. No one wanted to pay $20 million for an oceanfront estate that was about to lose its ocean view. No one wanted to live in a mansion where the sight of the Atlantic would be blocked by someone else's house. The value of Mar-a-Lago, already depressed by the maintenance costs and the years of sitting on the market, plummeted further. Trump had created a situation where he was the only possible buyer. He had engineered perfect leverage. In December of 1985, Donald Trump purchased Mar-a-Lago from the Post Foundation. The final price was $5 million for the real estate and $3 million for the furnishings. Various sources cite slightly different totals, some saying $7 million, some saying $8 million, some saying as much as $10 million when all fees and closing costs are included. The consensus among real estate professionals who studied the transaction is approximately $8 million total. This was well below the $20 million asking price the foundation had maintained for years. This was roughly what Marjorie Merriweather Post had spent building the house 58 years earlier. Before accounting for any inflation, the furnishings alone had been appraised at $8 million, which meant Trump had acquired the entire property, land, buildings, antiques, artwork, everything, for approximately the value of just the furniture. Trump also secured a $10 million mortgage from Chase Manhattan Bank to finance the purchase, putting down a cash payment of only $2,800 as his personal stake in the transaction. It was, by any objective measure, one of the shrewdest real estate acquisitions of the 1980s. It was also the only thing that saved Mar-a-Lago from demolition. If Trump hadn't bought it, the wrecking crews would have arrived within months. The house would have been torn down. The land would have been subdivided. Dozens of modern houses would now stand where Mar-a-Lago stands today. The palace that Marjorie built would have disappeared completely, remembered only in photographs and society page clippings from the 1920s. For 8 years, from 1985 to 1993, Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a private residence. He and his family spent winters there. He renovated extensively, investing millions in restoration and improvements while staying largely true to the original Spanish Revival architectural style. His wife at the time, Ivana Trump, took charge of managing the property. She hired staff, she oversaw maintenance, she planned events and hosted guests. The Trumps added a 20,000-square-foot ballroom to the property at a reported cost of $7 million. The ballroom was inspired by the Palace of Versailles and the court of Louis XIV, with a 40-foot ceiling, gold leaf plastered on the walls in elaborate patterns, and crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. They added 5 clay tennis courts. They built a waterfront swimming pool on the ocean side. They added 11 rooms to the main house, bringing the total from 118 to 126. The additions were substantial, but Trump preserved the historic character of the original structure. He understood what he owned. He understood that the value of Mar-a-Lago came from its history and architecture, not from modernizing it into something contemporary. By the early 1990s, Trump's business empire was in serious trouble. The casinos he owned in Atlantic City were losing money. The loans he had taken to finance construction projects were coming due. The banks and lenders who had financed his expansion were demanding solutions, restructuring, anything to get their money back. Trump was billions of dollars in debt. He proposed a solution for Mar-a-Lago. He would divide the property into 8 or 10 smaller residential lots, build houses on each lot and sell them individually to wealthy buyers. The plan made financial sense. The land was worth far more subdivided than it was as a single estate. But the plan required approval from the town of Palm Beach. Trump submitted his proposal. The town reviewed it at public hearings, and the town of Palm Beach said no. The zoning didn't allow it. The property had always been zoned for a single estate, not for subdivision. More importantly, the community didn't want it. Palm Beach was a quiet town of large estates and private clubs. Residents valued privacy and exclusivity, and they were not interested in seeing the town's most famous property carved into parcels with construction crews and new houses disrupting the neighborhood. The town council rejected Trump's subdivision plan decisively. Trump needed another solution. He found it in a legal structure that Marjorie would never have imagined, but that proved to be the key to Mar-a-Lago's survival. In 1995, Trump announced that Mar-a-Lago would become a private club. He would maintain a personal residence there, a 2,000-square-foot apartment carved out of the family quarters in a closed-off section of the grounds. The rest of the property would operate as a members-only club with guest rooms, a spa, tennis facilities, a beach club, and event venues available for private functions. Members would pay an initiation fee and annual dues for access to the facilities. The structure had multiple advantages. It allowed Trump to offset the crushing maintenance costs by treating them as legitimate business expenses of a club operation. It allowed him to continue living at the property while generating revenue from it. And it saved Mar-a-Lago from the financial death spiral that had already claimed so many other Gilded Age estates. Trump signed a formal legal document called a Deed of Conservation and Preservation, voluntarily giving up the right to use Mar-a-Lago for any purpose other than as a social club. In 2002, he agreed to a conservation easement that prevented further development of the property beyond what was already approved. These legal restrictions were permanent and binding. They would stay with the property regardless of who owned it in the future. Trump had locked Mar-a-Lago into its current use as a club in perpetuity. The conversion required extensive work. Trump hired Tamara Peacock, a preservation architect who specialized in historic properties, to lead the project. Peacock worked for months planning the conversion, determining which spaces would become public club areas and which would remain private, designing new facilities that would blend with the historic architecture, ensuring that all the changes met the requirements for maintaining the National Historic Landmark designation. The work had to be done carefully. One wrong move, one demolition of a historically significant wall or alteration of a protected space, and the landmark status could be revoked. Peacock later described the opening night of the Mar-a-Lago Club as one of the most memorable moments of her career. Trump had lights installed all along the oceanfront. The entire property was illuminated against the night sky. The house that had sat dark for years, that had been on the verge of demolition, that had been rejected by the government and couldn't find a buyer, was suddenly alive again with light and music and people, Peacock recalled in an interview years later. She also noted that Trump genuinely loved Mar-a-Lago and respected its history. Quote 4, she said. Quote 5, the Mar-a-Lago Club opened for members in 1995. Membership required a $200,000 initiation fee plus $14,000 in annual dues. The fees were steep, but they reflected the exclusivity of the property and the costs of maintaining it. The club offered access to the mansion's public rooms, the beach club, the pool, the tennis courts, the spa, and the dining rooms, where members could bring guests for dinner. The club also rented out spaces for private events, weddings, charity galas, corporate functions. The property that Marjorie had built to host presidents was now a members-only club where people paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for the privilege of attending. The house she had tried to gift to the government was now a private business. The estate that had nearly been demolished was lit up and filled with life and making money. And 22 years later, something would happen that Marjorie could never have imagined in her most optimistic dreams. The man who bought her palace would become president, and Mar-a-Lago would finally become the Winter White House. 2017, Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States on January 20th. Mar-a-Lago immediately became exactly what Marjorie Merriweather Post had intended more than 4 decades earlier. A winter White House, a venue for hosting foreign leaders, a place where diplomacy could be conducted in a more relaxed setting than the formality of Washington, where presidents could retreat during winter months and conduct the business of government while appearing to be on vacation. Trump visited Mar-a-Lago frequently during his presidency, particularly during the winter season from November through March. The media immediately began calling the property the Winter White House. Some reporters used the term ironically. Others used it descriptively. But everyone used it. The phrase stuck. Trump hosted international leaders at Mar-a-Lago, the way Marjorie had once hosted European royalty and American industrialists. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stayed at Mar-a-Lago in February of 2017, conducting sensitive negotiations about trade policy and military cooperation while staying in a guest suite that had been built as a bedroom for Marjorie's daughters. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited in April of that same year for a summit meeting that included formal dinners in the dining room where Marjorie had once hosted costume balls. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro attended dinners at Mar-a-Lago in March of 2019 and March of 2020, meeting with Trump to discuss cooperation on everything from trade to environmental policy. The meetings were controversial from the start. Critics argued that conducting government business at a private club owned by the president created obvious conflicts of interest. Members of the club could potentially overhear classified discussions. Staff working at the club could potentially access sensitive documents. The president was essentially requiring taxpayers to fund security and logistics for trips to his own property, where he profited from the club memberships and event fees that increased dramatically after he became president. Supporters of the arrangement pointed out that presidents have always sought retreats outside Washington. Franklin Roosevelt had Warm Springs. John F. Kennedy had the family compound in Hyannisport. Richard Nixon had San Clemente and Key Biscayne. George W. Bush had his ranch in Texas. Mar-a-Lago, they argued, was no different. It was just a place where the president could relax and work away from Washington. The security measures required when Trump was in residence were massive and expensive and disruptive to the entire Palm Beach community. When the president was at Mar-a-Lago, the Federal Aviation Administration established a 30 nautical mile temporary flight restriction zone around the property. No aircraft, except those explicitly authorized by the Secret Service, could fly anywhere near Mar-a-Lago. This effectively shut down normal air traffic patterns for Palm Beach International Airport, forcing planes to take circuitous routes and delaying flights. The Coast Guard secured the waterway approaches from both the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth Lagoon, deploying patrol boats that monitored every vessel that came anywhere near the property. The Secret Service cordoned off streets in the neighborhood, preventing residents from accessing their own homes without passing through security checkpoints and showing identification. The Palm Beach County Park Airport in Lantana, a small general aviation airport used by private planes and flight training schools, was completely shut down for entire weekends when Trump was in town. A specialized maritime safety and security team with capabilities for responding to threats from the water was deployed permanently to the area. The costs to federal taxpayers ran into the millions of dollars for each presidential visit. Money spent on overtime for Secret Service agents, Coast Guard personnel, and local police who assisted with security. In 2019, Trump officially declared Mar-a-Lago his primary residence, changing his legal domicile from New York to Florida. The move was widely understood as a tax strategy. Florida has no state income tax. New York has high state and city income taxes. For someone with Trump's income, the difference was worth millions of dollars per year. The change also allowed Trump to vote in Florida, a crucial swing state in presidential elections. The membership fees at the Mar-a-Lago Club increased dramatically after Trump became president. After his election in November 2016, the initiation fee, which had been lowered to $100,000 during the economic downturn following the Bernie Madoff scandal that had affected many Palm Beach residents, immediately returned to $200,000. By 2024, the fee had risen to $1 million with $20,000 in annual dues. Overnight guests who were not members could pay up to $2,000 per night for rooms. The club was operating at capacity with a waiting list for membership. Being a member of Mar-a-Lago when the owner was President of the United States carried a level of prestige and access that money alone couldn't usually buy. Marjorie's vision had been realized 44 years after her death. The Winter White House existed. It was functioning exactly as she had imagined. Presidents were hosting foreign dignitaries there. Diplomacy was being conducted in the room she had designed specifically for entertaining heads of state and conducting the informal negotiations that shape international relations. But the vision had been realized in a way she never could have anticipated, and almost certainly would not have approved. The property wasn't owned by the government. It was privately owned by the president himself. The house wasn't serving the nation as a public resource. It was serving as a private club where members paid $1 million for access. The diplomatic dinners weren't state functions paid for by taxpayers. They were club events where members could watch history happening while they ate the same food at nearby tables. Whether Marjorie would have approved of this arrangement is a question that has no answer. She's been dead for more than 50 years. She never imagined a scenario where a private club owner would become president. What is clear is this: the mansion survived, and it survived in the only way it could have. The 75-foot tower still stands between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth Lagoon. The 36,000 Spanish tiles are still there, many of them dating to the 15th century, each one placed by hand nearly 100 years ago. The Dorian limestone from Genoa still covers the exterior walls, its tiny embedded fossils still visible to anyone who looks closely at the stone. The gold-plated fixtures Marjorie believed were easier to clean still gleam in 33 bathrooms. The dining table that required 15 artists working for a year to complete still sits in a room modeled on a Roman palazzo, its 4,000-pound mass anchored to the floor. The house has been standing for nearly a century. It has survived the Great Depression and a world war. It has survived 4 transfers of ownership. It has survived federal government ownership and rejection. It has survived being listed for sale for years with no buyers. It has survived demolition permits and wrecking crews standing by. It has survived transformation into a private club and transformation into a winter White House that operates as a business. 3 generations have held the property. One built it to host presidents and foreign dignitaries in service of the nation. One inherited it and tried desperately to preserve that vision through a gift to the federal government. One bought it as a trophy for a fraction of its worth, faced financial ruin, turned it into a private club to survive, and then became president himself, fulfilling the original purpose in a way that inverts everything the original builder intended. Marjorie Merriweather Post crawled through jungle undergrowth on her hands and knees in 1924, searching for solid ground between the ocean and the lake. She spent $7 million and employed 600 workers for 4 years to build a palace from breakfast cereal money. She spent the final decades of her life trying to ensure it would serve the nation. The government rejected it. The market couldn't sell it. Demolition nearly claimed it. What saved it was commerce. What preserved it was turning it into a business. What fulfilled its purpose was a private club owned by a man who bought it through a hardball negotiation tactic. And then, improbably, became exactly the kind of president Marjorie had always imagined hosting there. The question she never got to answer is whether a winter White House that exists as a $1 million membership club is what she wanted, or whether the survival of the building itself is victory enough. Mar-a-Lago is not open to the public. It is not a museum where anyone can visit. It is not government property maintained for the benefit of all citizens. It is a national historic landmark that operates as a private business. You cannot visit unless you are a member or a guest of a member. The property is currently valued at approximately $350 million, though estimates vary widely depending on how you calculate the value of historic significance combined with prime beachfront real estate. The story is not finished. It continues every time a president returns there, every time diplomacy is conducted in those rooms, every time someone pays $1 million to join a club built by a woman who inherited a cereal fortune and believed she could change how America governed. The house stands. That is what matters most, not how it was saved or who saved it or what it became along the way. Just that it survived when so many other estates like it were demolished and forgotten. The tower is still visible for miles along the Palm Beach coast. The view from the observation deck still extends across the entire island. The house that was supposed to be a gift to the nation became instead a monument to what happens when visions outlast their dreamers. Marjorie Merriweather Post built something that would last centuries. She was right about that. She was wrong about almost everything else. And nearly a century after she crawled through that jungle undergrowth searching for solid ground, the house she built between sea and lake remains exactly where she placed it.